trying to get more steps in. I also want to point out that there is a link to this webcast on our mission site, our website. So if you know people who are not able to be here today who'd be interested, you can send them a link. It's on a YouTube link, but it's currently live streamed. It's on the calendar on the website. I know for a fact that our bishop has been watching, although he's probably on the plane right now, but he posted a picture of himself sitting in the Chicago airport holding up his phone with the live stream of this. So, yes. So I know at least one person has been watching that today, so we're happy about that. And I am going to turn this back over to Nathan. It looks like most of our folks are back.
Thanks, Chris. Well, any leftovers from the morning that we need to pick up as we gather back? Brownie. 2 points for you, yes. Brownie points, no less.
My daughter is one of those millennials. And she lives with me, and we had been at church yesterday, and a woman asked me to come and talk with her about a retreat for women. And so we made arrangements. Anyway, we left, and my daughter looks at me, and she says, "Just no, I'm not going to be there, Mom." And she says, "We don't do retreats." And I said, "What?" And she says, as a millennial, she says, we're not going to go on retreats and we're not going to sit there and read the Bible when we're out there with a bunch of women. That's not our thing. And she says, and if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be going to church now, because if I'm not going to sleep on Sunday morning, then I'm going to want to do something. I want to, and that's, your fitness and all of those things. She says, that's what we want to do. We want to do something, or either for ourselves or for the community or for some such, but just sitting and singing hymns and listening to a service just really isn't our thing. Now, she's been raised in the church and has pastor mom, et cetera, and she loves my sermons, supposedly. So, all our kids say. But nonetheless, that's an eye-opener that she just is not really interested. And she loves church, but if it wasn't for me, she wouldn't go.
Yeah. I have a friend who's a pastor in Kansas City who tells the story that it used to be that people would do their AIDS walk because they had been in the church and they saw this as an extension of faith. Now what they're seeing is people are doing the AIDS walk and finding faith because they're finding a community that cares about an issue they care about. It's sort of what you're describing, this flip of we want to do something and then the other thing may come. Yeah.
Talking about the changing trends and meeting the people where they are, one of the things that we talked about for almost 10 years recently was deconstruction, but deconstruction that doesn't feel like demolition. Too often when we talk about all these dire things and inundate people with all this data, it feels like demolition to them, not trying to save things that are worthy, but just everything's dying.
Well, and how do we put that against a Christian story where death is not actually the worst thing? And so if we're talking about dismantling or deconstruction, this is for the sake of resurrection.
Right. There has to be some kind of death before there can be a resurrection. But how do we get better?
Yeah. Any other leftovers from the morning? Anything that struck you over lunch?
What she said reminded me of something I've heard. In the evangelical world, it's living and rising, and they forget the death.
Yeah. Todd?
I don't know how it fits in exactly, but one of the interesting things at our congregation right now is that there are two ethnic communities that are worshiping with us. At right around 1 o'clock, a Kenyan community comes in, and the place is just popping, and with young children. And then at 4 o'clock, we have a Finnish community that comes in, and it's quiet and it's sedate and they're very private, and it's just it's intriguing. I don't know what that means exactly, but it's really interesting to see the ages of the different communities as well. There are some teenagers in the Finnish community, but no young children that are a part of that. And so it's just kind of fascinating for me to watch not only our own church, but other ethnic ministries that are a part of it.
Thank you.
I could talk about the Finns in the UP where I come from back in Wisconsin, but they have that reputation of being gloomy. And they will say it. They're proud of the fact that they are gloomy.
What a great description. One more, and then
Do you have any statistics? I'll ask for another statistic of the differences between Gen X and millennials?
when it comes to what part?
Church.
Church. I would have to look them up and get them to you, which I'm happy to do. So.
Well, it just dawned on me that my older two kids are Gen X kids, and they both go to church. And my youngest is a millennial. No.
Yeah, so there's a great book by Hayden Shaw, Haydn Shaw, who he's done 2 books. One is called Sticking Points, and it's talking about the 12 places, the 4 generations that are presently in the workplace come apart. And it's everything from meetings to learning style to commitment. And then his latest book is actually about generational differences in the church. It's both of them are must reads in my judgment for preaching. What's the name of the second one? It's beautiful. It has a red cover. Yes, it looks so nice on my shelf. Anyway, look up both of those books because they also get to this. And part of what he distinguishes is that one of the differences between Gen X and the millennials is actually just a different definition of commitment. And in my context, at least, we're seeing a different definition of good Sunday morning regular attendance. It used to be that good regular attendance was 3 times a month, and now it's like 1.5. Thank you. Congregational IQ. Generational IQ. Thank you. I love this world. Yeah.
And in my church, we have a lady that it's her business to understand and the trends of the different generations and that kind of thing. And she has been telling us that the generation coming up, I don't know if that's I don't know what you call them.
It's the one after.
She is saying that they are more like the people in the 50s and 60s, and that we're going to see a turnaround in what church will look like today.
Yeah.
But they have the same wants and desires because the latchkey kid that went home learned how to entertain themselves, and therefore they don't need community as much as the generations that followed.
Yeah. Yeah, there are generational parallels. One of the things is to remember the formative events for a generation, and to think back through what cultural events, what societal events have actually formed the worldview. And when you think about this youngest generation that's now with us, we have the generation that grew up post 9/11. So there has always been a war on terror. There has always been a financial crisis. There has always been those kinds of realities. And so it's not surprising that this generation, the youngest generation, is the least optimistic. And yet they have some parallels to the greatest generation and to the baby boomers. And so how do we see that connection over time? All right. Well, yeah, sorry.
I don't need it you can repeat it, but the question
Yeah.
I've got is about what you were just talking about the frequency of worship.
Yes.
Do you know if there are any studies that go along with that?
It's a good question. Mostly it's anecdotal. But I mean, what I've really heard is a shift from 3 to 4 to 1 to 2. And the sense of, if I miss worship,
I use that an awful lot as I'm talking with people, but I don't have any
yeah.
data to support it.
Yeah, what's also interesting to me is I hear it everywhere I go. So it's not like in one part of the country there's an immunity to it that it tends to track across. All right, well, this afternoon we're going to spend some time talking about how do you lead in response to these trends? How do you serve as a congregational leader, whether lay or ordained? How do you serve in these times against this particular backdrop? And to help us get started, because this is the dreaded after lunch time slot, and all of our blood sugars are about to tank, let's begin by spending a little bit of time in individual reflection. And then in small group conversation, and really around this question. This is an exercise called Stepping Stones. And what I'd like you to do is to think back across your life, to think back across your Christian life, your life generally, and to identify 5 or 6 people, places, or choice points that have shaped your vision and understanding of pastoral or lay ministry. As you think back across the 5 or 6 choice points, who, what, where?
Tina's going to get some paper.
Oh, great. Or you can do it on your phone or tablet or e-reader or whatever you have with you. No, I'm not collecting. This is for you. So think about who, what.
There are napkins over there. Those.
Yeah, exactly. Who, what, where? Who was it that cast a shadow over your life? Who inspired you? Yes, we'll get there. Hang on just one second. The second, what was it you learned from that person? What was it you learned from that event? What was it you learned from that congregation? What did they teach you about what it meant to be in lay ministry? What did they teach you about what it meant to be an ordained person? What did you learn there? And then, as you were just noting, Catherine, not all of them must be positive. In fact, most of us have learned more from the cautionary tales in our lives, the clergy who flamed out, the person who violated a boundary, all of those kinds of things. We learned something about what it meant to be a lay leader or to be an ordained leader in response to those events. So the choice is yours to really decide how you want to do this. You can just make a list. You can map it if you'd like to draw a map of your life and identify these points. But the time is yours. You have 15 minutes, so this isn't going to be your deepest reflection ever. But 15 minutes to identify 5 or 6 people, places, events. At the end of 15 minutes, we'll be back in here and we'll take our next step. You can go anywhere. stories. take a minute to finish up your conversations. May I?
I feel like I have met you somewhere years
All right, let's come back together. You can stay where you are for the moment. That way, so we're not doing a lot of moving. What did you hear as common threads or common elements of your stories? Say that.
I said the people that seem to have affected us or influenced us the most, who affirmed us and spoke our own truth to us, were not perfect, shiny people. They weren't these pillars of efficiency and integrity. They were human. They were real people. Yeah.
I liked what you said
About
the blessing that you were given. Just the words.
yeah, that excuse me, of having someone at a pretty particular time just remark me with the baptismal statement of child of God, sealed and marked with the cross of Christ, but then to continue beyond that of created as you are and called to ministry because of who you are. And as someone who's just coming out over the last couple of years, this makes was really a very powerful moment to affirm my call and my ministry, even as I'm struggling with identity and trying to really decide, am I really still part of this, and can I really do this?
Thank you. Other threads you heard?
It's really the Holy Spirit working through everyone and not necessarily any one person's influence, but it's just much greater than each of us.
I'm going to speak on our behalf. I had not really thought about places as much. I was focused on people, but as Ann was talking and we were talking about places, and we all started sharing a little bit more about that, the thread that I was hearing a lot was about empowerment and discovering our own gifts, and that was a big part of what, those people in those places that helped us to actually discover the gifts that we had for ministry, that we, and helping to claim it and live it was an important part.
Yeah. Anything else you heard?
Two of us mentioned that it was not a person or a place, but a circumstance, and it was going through depression that shaped into reliance, I guess, on God, and the understanding that we are all broken.
Yeah.
Whether we think we are or not, that we think we may be strong people, that we are all broken. And that sense of brokenness and the ability to reach out pastorally after, through those circumstances. So I thought that was kind of different.
Yeah. Thank you. Anything else that you heard that you sorry.
Just kind of related to that in the sense of those broken places, or that the call to find self-care and an accountability group was helpful, at least for me in one of my situations. So, yeah, learning that we are valuable and precious to God, and that we need to surround ourselves with other and with healing people who can help bring healing to us. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I think one of the threats that I learned from our discussion is when we try to depend on our ability to do great things. What we learn here is we depend on God. God is the one we should depend on to do whatever, and even in our ministry. Because many times, if we start doing great things, then we start taking the glory. And we believe God does not share his glory with anybody. So we need to give God the glory and depend on him.
Thank you.
I was impressed by how each of us had people who had influenced us as very young children. And it impressed me, made me think that, I mean, I'm not a Sunday school teacher, but God bless them. And other people, other adults in the lives of small children who have influence that they have no knowledge of, probably. But what important thread that is.
I wanted to jump on that too. It's one of the things I find myself often saying is I don't know if I ever learned anything in Sunday school, but at least 3 Sunday school teachers are on my list. And you know, for those congregations that may not have Sunday school anymore, finding an intentional way about helping connect kids and adults, I think is, and we're doing that process by something called Stepping Stones.
Great.
So I thought it was really cool. So.
Any other observations, threads you want to pull or name for us? No.
Just that you can't predict. I think that was one of the threads. You can't predict where those are going to come from. Yeah, like it came out of nowhere, kind of thing, unexpectedly. The thing that drew you back to God, or drew you to God, or transformed you and made you see things differently, or helped you to grow. Yeah. Don't try to predict God. It doesn't usually work that way.
We all had experiences where we thought we had been changed or grew from the most uncomfortable places. Places we had been led that were difficult and challenging and uncomfortable, and yet brought a lot of blessing.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Let's return to your seats, and we'll take our next step. Do you want me? Okay. All right. So part of the gift of doing that exercise, part of the reason why we want to do it, is to acknowledge that there are these figures that shine light across our life, that there are these times in our ministries and in our vocation when we've glimpsed something. Either the person who helps us glimpse it in ourselves, the event that helps us name it for ourselves, the moment that the Spirit shows up and does something remarkable in spite of us or because of us. It's sometimes hard to know. But there are those places that stand large across our life. Now, here's a hint. If you did this tomorrow, you'd come up probably with a different 5 or 6. And so every time you do it, anytime you need to remember, what does this life look like? I'd encourage you to go back and name for yourself these kinds of seminal moments and ask, what am I learning? And what is my life teaching me? What is my life and vocation and ministry teaching me? The only challenge in this, the only challenge of naming these people who stand large over our life, these people who have spoken words of grace and hope and love, these situations in which we've struggled, is oftentimes what comes with them this. It is this kind of deep sense that says, well, I should be a person like so-and-so. In our worst moments, this is what comes up. In our worst moments, when fear and anxiety set in, oftentimes that's the point we start shooting on ourselves. And we start saying, I'm not sure. I should be the pastor who, I should be the lay leader who can. And again, the danger is that we see trends like the ones we looked at this morning, and rather than actually saying, I'm not alone, we're all in this together, the danger is we say, well, if I was a better pastor, if I was a better preacher, if I knew how to run a better council meeting, then none of these problems would be happening, and the church would be great. The gift is, it's not you. That's the gift. But somehow, for God's good pleasure, you are the one in these positions. And you are the one in these places. And you're the one who's figuring out what does it mean to be a pastor here and now. And so part of what I want to encourage you this afternoon is to stop the shoulds. To realize that we're entering into a really uncharted territory, at least in our memory. It's not uncharted territory for the church's memory. It's uncharted territory for ours. And so part of what I hope you've noticed is on most of the slides, there's been this ink splatter.
Oh, it's not a blood spot? Okay,
really, no. Part of what I want to encourage you to do is splatter paint. To risk it, to make a mess. Trusting that in God's economy, the mess isn't a mess. It's time to risk and experiment. It's time to find some freedom and flexibility. It's time to find the joy in our calling and to actually risk some stuff. Some of it's going to be beautiful. Some of it's going to look like Jackson Pollock. And other parts of it are going to look like third grader finger paints on the refrigerator. And it's hard to know when you're going into it which is which. But the gift is God has put you in these positions. Who you are, I love how you said that. Because of who you are, for who you are in these roles now to help the church figure out what can be. Now, I mentioned before, over 1/3 of the clergy are in part-time and or bivocational ministry. This is true in my own life. You heard it in the introduction, that this is my congregation. This is the Episcopal Church of the Advocate in Chapel Hill. It's a 19th century building that we moved 86 miles to become our congregation. All the wood is original except for that part. It's a beautiful community. This is Pentecost, and all of us are in red. It's a great time. Anyway, it's great. The challenge is it's on top of the other thing in my life. It's on top of the other full-time job. But that's okay, because I come from a legacy of this. This is my mother's church. This is Massey's Chapel United Methodist Church in Durham, where she's part-time. And she's figuring out what it means to be in part-time ministry too. And somehow, miraculously, she's taken this place that was in decline. They had 20 when she showed up. They now have 2 Sunday morning services and average 80 on Sunday. I don't know how. I'm confident it's beyond her. But it's through her that something is happening. But in my life, this is what that looks like. Full-time, and this thing on top. In her life, this is what it looks like. and all that stuff on the side, all the other things that she has to do. And so in many ways, we are just trying to figure out, what does it mean to be engaged in part-time ministry? What does it mean to be engaged in this cultural context for the revitalization and renewal of the church, when this is not the place we can give our full-time energy and our full-time passion? And so part of what this begins to say, in my mother's case and in mine, is that what we're facing are wicked problems. And what we're facing are problems that people assume that we as the clergy have the answer. And that we go up on top of the mountain, and like Moses, we receive the tablet of God's answer and we bring it down and we say, and this is what we should do. Right. I mean, if you remember, he came down the mountain and what did he find? Idol worship. Nice cow. I mean, this didn't work so well for him. But the myth culturally is that the leader, in quotes, is the one who goes, figures out what this looks like, and then comes back and tells people, and so this is what we need to do. This is the myth. You'll pardon, this is where we live. We live with wicked problems, the kind of problems that the more we turn them, the more dimensions we see, but they're never static. And the more we try something, the more elements of the problem we actually see. The more we play with something, the more we say, oh, you know what, I think we could try this. The next thing you know, the boiler blows. And so the problems and the complexity of what we're facing begin to suggest that the way we think about these things doesn't work anymore. That the way we have thought about them is that if we go up the mountain, we'll find stone tablets and everything's going to be okay. Which in some ways is decision thinking. Do you know this distinction? The difference between decision thinking and design thinking? All right, this is how I describe it. Others of you will describe it in different ways, and so I hope you'll share that with one another. Decision thinking presumes that most of our major issues are recurring. That the problems we face are the problems we've always faced, will be the problems we always face. We don't have young people. The church 20 years ago didn't have young people. The church 20 years from now will not have young people. This is a constant problem in our lives. Decision thinking presumes that we have defined options. That the answer is either that we renew Sunday school or that we start a preschool. Those are the two options. So go, choose one or the other, A or B. We presume that we have all the required information we need. That everything that we need to make the good decision, the right decision, is in our hand. And that decision, all we need to really do is apply practiced ways, familiar means, and known relationships. That everything you need to solve the wicked problems facing your congregation is at hand. Now, I'm here to tell you that in my mother's experience, in my experience, maybe in yours, this doesn't work anymore. This doesn't work for figuring out, how do I balance full pastoral care responsibilities with a full-time job? It doesn't work for her trying to figure out how to do full-time ministry on really part-time pay. It doesn't work anymore. And so what we're doing, and what congregations around the country are finding, is design thinking, which is a different way of coming together. It sees issues as recurring trends and specific problems. So it sees both the recurring, but then it also sees what's interesting in this instance, what makes this inflection point different than other times in our past. Why is it that it's not just a question of the church has always struggled to get kids, just suck it up? If it's not that, then what's so different about our time now? What is making this a different context? Design thinking also says that there are some clear some unclear, and some completely unknown solutions. That the problems we can come up with and the solutions to those problems are incomplete lists. That the information at hand is at best partial. And that as we try and move forward, we're going to surface new dimensions of the problem. And we're going to find and highlight different elements of the challenge. And that that's going to shape how we're doing this. And that our response to the challenges that we're presented with will evolve. Design thinking also says that values the process over the decision. It matters much more how we get there than where we get. So what matters in design thinking is who's at the table. Who are you bringing together with you to talk about the situations you find yourself in? Who are the people who are shaping your imagination about this? And then last, it narrates the challenge in terms of values. So rather than actually narrating the challenge in terms of, the budget, it narrates the challenge by saying, what do we value? What are we committed to? What's the kind of church we aim to be? And then how do we work backwards? Does that make sense? Design thinking, one of the benefits of it in this particular time, as we're thinking specifically around part-time and bivocational clergy, as we're thinking about people who are serving in that setting, part of what it forces us to do is get very clear on the ministerial role. We actually have to get really clear on what is core, on what we value most, in order to begin to address the situations that face us. And so part of what we narrated, you all narrated earlier, I think it was Neil who gave voice to it, is this question about what does it mean to be a Lutheran facing these challenges, as opposed to what does it mean to be, a Baptist facing these challenges. Our office calls this something quirky because, we had to. We've named this traditioned innovation. Because part of what, do we need to move this? Okay, anyway. Part of what we noticed is that in our work with denominations, and in our work with pastors around the country and around the world, what we saw was a desire for innovation. And they wanted new and exciting. They wanted new, like the new boy band and this new fog machine. And this is what they really, really wanted. But the problem was they were pretending like what they had was a blank slate. And so anything could go. And we could do anything to respond to the problem. But that wasn't the case, was it? Because what we needed was an answer that was deeply rooted in who we were, in the values we shared, in our common understandings, in our common ways of being. What we needed was to figure out how to innovate within tradition and upon tradition, rather than innovate away from it. We had to figure out a way that going deep could tell us the essentials, and then we could play with all the rest. Does that make sense? Todd?
Yeah, but my spell check says tradition is misspelled.
It is. Yeah.
Oh, wait, is that decision thinking? I'm sorry.
Part of what, it's funny you would say that, because when our office first came into being, one of the things that happened was colleagues of mine created all of these creative two-word pairings. They all... we can do that. We can totally do that. That's your responsibility. But so we had all these things like tradition, innovation, vibrant institutions, transformative leadership, blah, blah, blah. They all belonged on a t-shirt, is what they really did, or embroidered on a pillow. And yet what it points to is true. Whatever you call it, part of our responsibility now is to get really clear on the tradition and then innovate within it. And so at your table, this goes back to the design thinking question about working from values. We're going to take the example of part-time bivocational clergy. I want you to think at your table about what do you value? What does the tradition value about a pastoral presence? What is it in your tradition that the tradition suggests is core? What can't be sacrificed? Now, to respect tradition, you have 10 minutes to do this. So quickly have a conversation at your table. Great question. Well, we'll come back. All right, so what did you hear as core to the tradition? Sorry, what did you hear as core to the tradition? Yes. Proclaim the gospel. Okay. What else? Thank you. Word and sacrament. Okay.
Yeah. The role, the way how Jesus was doing the ministry, I think we have to go back to see how he was doing the ministry, because it seems that we Lutheran, we start from Martin Luther, come this way, but we forget from Jesus to Martin Luther. So, so I think so I think if we go back and we study how Jesus was doing ministry, how he was training people, equip them and sending them, I think we can get there.
Thank you.
That's the best line of the day.
Paul was a part-time pastor. Yes, this is true. There is a precedent for this. Yes. Other comments? Other things that you heard as core? All right, somebody from this table. Your question.
We started to question what is actually tradition in the sense of foundational to our belief and our confessions, and what is tradition as in the sense of what do people traditionally expect of a pastor, such as the expectation that only the pastor should take communion to people that are shut in, or only the ordained pastor can preach, or only the ordained pastor can preside at weddings and funerals and do the visitation in hospitals. You know, I only want to see the pastor. But are those really our Lutheran tradition, or have they become traditions?
It's a great question. You remember Yaroslav Pelikan, the historian at Yale, and one of the things he says is that tradition is the living faith of the dead, while traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And it becomes a crucial distinction. Part of the reason why I structured this conversation the way I did, and part of the reason we waited till the 11th hour to begin talking about it, is because what you hear almost immediately is, what is the tradition? You hear this clash of traditions. Remember, this is polyphonic. It speaks in multiple voices. And one of the dangerous parts right now is that, one of the liberating parts right now, but also one of the dangerous parts, is we are recovering voices that for too long have not been heard. And so part of what we're doing in this season in the life of the church is we're actually making tradition much more complicated, much richer. And it's these kinds of conversations around your table that, if they happen in your parish, will actually make this work much harder, and yet much more beautiful. Because these traditions, these trends that we're naming, the water we swim in, they actually need a complicated view of tradition. Because the simple view of tradition won't let us innovate correctly. We need the conversation around the clash of values. That a congregation may care about pastoral care and may care about good preaching, but they may not care about administration. And you may say, no, I got to watch something. I got to pay attention to some numbers. And I would not be faithful if I didn't do this. And it's in the collision of values, in the way that those traditions mix and mingle, that the exciting innovation can be born. Yeah.
In intentional interim ministry training, they talk not only of the importance of creating kind of a contract or a covenant for that relationship, which I think is incredibly important, but they also pushed on us, if the contract is going to be something that's part-time, think of it in terms of a month rather than in terms of the week, which means if it's 3/4 time, you're there 3 Sundays during the month, and you're absent 1 Sunday during the month. Just part of, to think of it a different way, but also to be able help the congregation recognize there's ministry beyond Sunday, you know, and a pastor needs to be engaged in that as well, but that the congregation can find ways then of dealing with that absence in a creative way, especially if they're going to have a part-time person replace the interim.
Part of the temptation is that we move too quickly to the technical questions. When are you showing up? How many Sundays a month? And part of my appeal to you is to make the question as complicated as you can on the beginning. And then trust that over time, the critical pieces get sorted and sifted out. Because by doing what you just did, by beginning the conversation with values and what does the tradition teach us and what do we care most about, the other stuff starts to answer itself. How should I spend my week? Well, if I start with that, I'm going to get it wrong because I'm not going to make values-driven answers. But if I begin by saying, what's the right way? What's the way that I can spend my time in a faithful way? What's core to my vocation? Then how do I move forward? This morning we talked a little bit about declining trust in institutions. And I gave you the statistic. Trust in clergy has never been lower in poll data. In 4 decades, in fact, we are at the lowest point. And generally what that indicates, actually, is a suspicion around benevolence. Okay, so psychologists tell us trust is rooted in 3 things: competence, integrity, and benevolence. And part of what we can correlate is that the decline in trust in clergy began at the same time that the revelations around the sexual abuse scandals happened. And so part of what happened is the society generally began to say, we don't necessarily trust that you have our good at heart. Now that's hard. The only way that that gets overcome is by going deep into the tradition, by actually recovering what has been misplaced, which in many ways is that clergy and lay leaders of congregations are meant to be models of friendship. And this is what I want to leave you with, because I think this helps us think about part-time issues, but it also lets us think about the spirituality of ministry. It lets us think about how we sustain our vocation. It lets us think about how do we have conversations around values. There is a deep tradition in Christian theology, Christian ethics, and philosophy which says that the good is found in friendship, that none of us get good on our own, but in fact we need to cultivate deep and robust friendship, and that friendship shapes who we are. When we think about it scripturally, this friendship takes 3 forms. Friendship with God, the kind of spiritual practices that keep your soul alive in ministry, Bible reading, prayer, fasting, meditation, those practices that keep spirit alive within. But then there's a second dimension, which is a friendship with each other. In a season of distrust or mistrust or lack of trust, if people don't trust that we have their good at heart, friendship can overcome that. By befriending the other, you accept the other as they are. And then you work for their good. And then finally, there's a third dimension to it, which is a friendship with ourself. It's the hidden third in the twofold great commandment. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as, which presumes you love yourself in a wholly healthy way. Ministry actually begins from a place where we align who we are with this deep desire of God for all creation. And we see that God wants that for us as much as God wants it for the person sitting next to us and the person who is very much unlike us. To me, this becomes the core of the priestly pastoral vocation in this time and place, that we actually reach out into the world with good news that is rooted in our friendship with God, one another, and with ourselves. And if that becomes the core, then the questions about these trends start to sort themselves out. Or we at least see the trend in a different way. Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan, for all of the wisdom you have shared with us, for the thoughts you have provoked in us, for the questions you leave us with, because there are still many. I was hoping for more answers. Any thoughts before we go? Any? Okay.
Any of the stuff that you just got talking about, all those great quotes and stuff, is any of that on your PowerPoint? Yes. Okay.
The other thing I would recommend to you is a spiritual classic written before Martin Luther by Allred of Rivlow. Some of you may know him. This great book called Spiritual Friendship, where he talks about his experience of being an abbot in a monastery and the way that for most of us we spend our lives cultivating friendships of vice, friendships of use, but not many of us spend our lives cultivating spiritual friendships. And so it's called Spiritual Friendship. Allred of Rivlow, Aelred. And yes, I'll include quotes, book lists, all of that, along with the PowerPoints. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before we go? I will send us with prayer then. Let's pray. Gracious God, as we journey to our homes, watch over us and keep us safe. Keep us strong in your spirit. Keep us faithful to our ministry and guide us in your ways. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Go in peace. Serve the Lord.